Hello. Today I have a Saturday with the house to myself, and so I'm going to put together my gearbox, crankcase, well, basically the entire lower end of my 1974 MZ Ts250 drag bike. This is a particularly fun engine to assemble because pretty much everything has to be heated or cooled in order to fit inside its particular housing. Some things you can tap home, some things you can't. But it is really useful and makes things a lot easier to simply follow the instructions they give you in the manuals and heat things up. Because when you heat things up, it opens up the bearing opening will get bigger, more so than the shaft going in it. So when you drop it in there, it'll fit much more nicely. This has not been heated. You can see it's a little bit of a tight fit. It'll go, but you gotta whack it. You want to whack it. If you heat this, for example, this bearing here goes on the outside of the crankshaft. But it's a tight fit right now, and you don't want to pound on that. You'll distort the crank web. If I put this thing in the oven for a few minutes, get it nice and toasty, it'll just drop right on there, and then when it cools off, it'll crank up real tight. But there's a particular order in which you have to do these things. And one of the problems with this engine is the crank seals are actually inside the bearings. They actually go like this, and yes, that's how they came out. Springs facing outside. I know common knowledge is springs face the oil. But when MZ designed these and built the motors, when I took it apart, it was fresh from the factory. These seals were like this. Now, why do you think that is? Why would they put the seals the wrong direction? Well, back in the old days of the single lip seals, you were much more likely to have a leak going this way through the seal than this way. So, what they were trying to do by putting the seal this direction was allow the seal to fail only outward. And why would you only want the seal to face outward? Well, if you suck fresh air into a two-stroke crankcase post-carburetor, you get an extremely lean condition which generates an enormous amount of heat and will eventually put a hole in your piston, and you will not be happy. So that's why they put them that way. They wanted the bike, they planned ahead for the failure, and they directed the failure to be less catastrophic. If the air leaks out, if the compressed mixture leaks out of the crankcase, no real harm done except for poor performance. If it sucks air in, then you're in big trouble. So they put them like that. Nowadays we have modern double lip seals. You could probably put them either way. I think I'm even putting them the right way. This is just a drag bike. It's just going to go really fast a couple times and then cool right back off. It's not like my daily rider. But I know when I rebuilt, I'm pretty sure I put them back on this way and have 3,000 miles on it, no problems. But again, doesn't matter so much anymore. But interesting tidbit that MZ did put these seals on the wrong direction. I've taken apart 3 motors that were from the factory, and all 3 of them were like that. And that was their reason. So, anyway, in order to set these in, so if you put the seal on first and put the bearing on after, when you put the crankcase on, it tends to grab the seal and smash it against the crankshaft web here, which causes it to hang up, and there's a lot of drag and friction, blah, blah, blah. Probably eventually melt this in. It'll probably wear out and eventually be okay, but who really wants that? So, the way to do this is to get the bearing in the motor housing first, and have the seal and the bearing in there first, and then drop the whole mess onto the crankshaft. How I did the other side was, I heated up this side of the crankcase with the bearing, and took it all out, brought it up here, dropped the bearing in against the circlip, tapped the oil seal in, and then when the bearing's still hot enough, this crankshaft just drops straight in. I had 2 previous attempts where I waited too long, the bearing got too cool, and the crankshaft would not go in. It was quite an adventure. So I had to press it back out very carefully, drift the bearing out from the other side, catch the crankshaft as it came out, and heat it up enough this time to do it again. So that will be the final half of the crankshaft assembly. I'm not doing that yet. What we're doing first is our transmission. These are the output gears, and they actually fit nicely in here. This gear and this whole shaft had been heat treated because we swapped these 2 gears around, which I explained in another video. So with the heat treating adds just a tiny layer of some kind of oxide or something to it, so it would not fit in the bearing nicely. I turned it down just ever so slightly with some very fine emery cloth on the lathe till it was just a nice fit. So there's that. That goes in. That's what I put in first anyway. And then this one goes in next to it. And that will just slide off, so you gotta be careful that everything's in the right place and you don't lose that washer, because otherwise bad things will happen. You'll get 2 gears running at once, and you'll have no gears. So, and this fits in. You just got to make sure you line everything up, and it drops right down into place. This thing is still a little warm, so that fit in nicely. Usually you got to give it a little push. Okay, then we have our shift forks. A bigger one, slightly bigger one, goes to the bigger gears. That's how I remember it. And they can only go on one way. You got to have this little indexing pin facing downward towards the shift drum. So the other one will be the opposite. They'll kind of like be one this way, one that way. Pins face straight down towards the center of that circle, so it's easy to figure out how they go. You really cannot put these in wrong. You put them in upside down, they won't fit, because this slotting has been biased to one side, so it won't even go in the wrong way. It's kind of nice. So you can have that in there. There's a little washer that goes down there I'm not going to put in because it's on the end of the shaft. But I will put that in for the final actual assembly. This is just a demonstration run. So where's that little guide pin? Anyway, this goes on first. This is our selector drum. It has these little grooves cut in it that, as it rotates, moves these forks to the appropriate position for the gears you want. This is the point in the tracks where it's first gear, that's fourth gear. It goes all the way around this path. So you know where the stopping point is. That's an important landmark to remember, because when you're putting this in, the instructions tell you to align the dot on this quadrant, tiny little dot right there, you can't really see it, with the chamfered tooth on this gear. Now, unless you put a micrometer up to it, it's really hard to tell which one is the extra chamfered gear, because they're all chamfered, and one of them is a little more, so you can barely tell, but that's it right there. That's the one. So when that one is facing the right direction, this part of the shift drum is facing straight down. So that's another way to tell, if you can't find that one slightly more beveled tooth that they tell of in the little legend. So getting this in is a little tricky, but once you get that in, you slide the pin into that one, and they're both going to be on their own little path. So that pin has to find its little slot, and this pin has to find this little slot. You may have to spin the gears a little bit to get them all to mesh, but they will. And you line that up, and then you want to be on the hillside. There we go. That's why it's moving. So then, here's the guide that the forks travel upon. Then you can drop that in, and go through the top one, go through the bottom one, and all the way down to the bottom. You can just see the hole, and it will go into that, like so. And there we have all our gears. So you can begin to move the gears around and actually shift it. And right now, I'm at fourth. I think I'm at fourth. No, yeah, that's fourth gear. So, and as I rotate this, it will select different gears, and you can barely tell, but these shafts will begin spinning at different ratios. All the gears are constantly enmeshed. That's a fact of pretty much every transmission I've ever seen. I don't know why they even use the term constant mesh, because they're all constantly meshed. The only thing you're moving in and out is the drive dogs that engage the sliding gears with the ones that freewheel. So, motorcycle transmission doesn't have a synchro mesh, so it's a lot simpler. It's just a dog box. They just clunk together, and it's a little, it's primitive, but it works. They don't do that in cars because it would be really clunky and scary. And synchro mesh makes the shift a lot smoother. I believe large semi-trucks and other large vehicles have non-synchronized transmissions as well, but most motorcycles simply don't have it. The reason being, in my opinion, is because synchro meshes take up space. And you'd have a pretty wide gearbox if you put a synchro mesh in a motorcycle tranny. Cars, they run along wise, they got all the space in the world. So, okay, that's that. So we're going to move our selector drum to our desired position with the extra chamfered tooth this way, and the path stop and stop at the bottom. There's our selector quadrant. You need to have the little catch pawls arranged as such. Second tooth down, all the way down, one all the way at the bottom. And this will go very carefully in here, watching that dot. So the groove represented by that dot aligns with the chamfered tooth. That will put this in the correct position to work all the gears. Now, I've had bikes where I didn't have the advantage of the manual to tell me that, and it was a matter of guess and check. And eventually, you know, you can kind of figure it out. You know, you move it to the extreme on one end, the extreme on the other end. I was a little confused by this one at first because I was running the gears through, and this thing was sticking out of the bottom of the engine case. I'm like, how can that be the right way it works if this, you know, the selector gear driver sticks at the bottom? Well, the fact is, it doesn't. If you look at the other half of the case, that piece actually dives into this hole here. So it looks like it's coming out of the bottom of the case from this side, but it really won't be when the bike's all together. So I was kind of scratching my head about that for a while, and then I said, heck with it, put it together, and oh, lo and behold, everything just works just fine. So that's the whole kit and caboodle together. The fun part is dropping the other half of the case on, because you've got a bearing that goes here, which is already on this shaft, and you've got, this has to stick through. We're going to put the seal on first, because you don't want the seal pressing against the crankshaft, so that's going to go in first. And then, everything nice and hot, I should be able to drop the last crank bearing right in. It'll fit right around. These crank bearings are usually pretty tight in the housing, but the guy who did the engine mods for me also ground down the outside of the bearings just a teeny bit, so they're more of a slip fit. Kind of like a Honda. Every Honda I've ever taken apart, the engine just slips right apart. This one, you have to heat the living crap out of it. So, anyway, that's about the length of that. And let me show you how I heat up the crankcase. This is actually pretty handy. I have a kerosene heater in the garage here, and these cylinder studs work out just perfectly. You can just slip these under like that. There we go. And then it props it up there right above his kerosene heater. And this thing gets hot enough for the bearings will just fall out in about 5 minutes. First time I heated it up, this bearing just dropped onto the floor in about 2 minutes. I was like, wow, that was quick. It really does work well. You want to try to do as few heating operations as possible. So if you can get everything all hot at once and work with it while it's still warm, slap it all together, the better off you are. But it's not always easy to coordinate that quickly, and things cool down. It's cold out here right now, so everything cools off quickly. It's really hard to assemble this thing if everything's cold. Some things just will not go together, so you got to heat one thing and let everything cool. But other than that, pretty straightforward engine. It goes together pretty quickly and easily. Just getting all these things lined up. Looks like it's going to be tough, but once you tap it together, it's just fine. So once I have this thing nice and warm, I can just drop it all on there and close it up and call it a day. Got to put a little sealant here. There is no gasket. It's just sealant. Amazing how that actually works, but it does. Aftermarket rebuild kits include a gasket here. I don't think that's a good idea. Changes the spacing, and the spacing is critical for these gears to stay where they got to stay, but people do it. And you can actually adjust these. You're supposed to be able to tap these back and forth to align the gears just right. Once the engines are together, they had a little window here to reach in there, and you put a feeler gauge between two gears, and depending on how big that was, you tap this one left or tap that one right. It's kind of hokey. You'd think it'd be a little more in holding the gears in place, but there really is no sideways pressure on these things. Once the bike's running, these gears aren't helical cut or anything, so you just slide back and forth. There's no pressure on these shafts. So anyway, that's about it for this video. We're going to get it together and hopefully have a running engine here in a few weeks. Ciao.